Greetings, everyone. This is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever, and today's video is going to be called Torath Mosheh and Science, a Perspective. So, one of the things I wanted to talk about for a long time, and I kind of switched back and forth for a number of years of how to do a video about this topic, um, was I decided to kind of start it from the perspective of what I consider to be a Western problem between science versus religion, which, these, graphics that I'm showing now, kind of the way I look at it are mainly what the basic issues are in the Western world towards the concept of science and religion, specifically that of Christianity, I would say, more than anything else. Because generally speaking, the basic idea that people have is that, you have on one side science, when, which this graphic seems to say that even when you have tons of evidence, doubt what you see, versus what people decide to say religion is even without a single piece of evidence, believe in what you can't see. And as anyone knows that according to Torath Mosheh, this is completely, not, at all accurate in terms of Torath Mosheh. It may be in terms of what is generally t styled as religion. Um, in the, I guess, the Western sense. But in terms of Torath Moshe, it works the exact same way that this is being spoken of here. But then, I've also found that people who say that they believe in science or hold by science, there are some people, not all, but who have the same kind of religious attitude about it. Meaning that there are people who've never experimented on something a day in their life in a lab. They've never actually researched something, actually using the text themselves, whether it be, like actual books on science, as well as the processes that were taken. And then just simply believe something because someone put slap science on it, and then it's believable just because it says science. Or a particular person who's considered to be a scientist says it, so it must be true, without actually questioning, okay, well, wait a minute, what exactly does that mean? When you say that, does it actually, give evidence to, or credence to this idea? Or is it possible I don't understand what you mean? So you can find people on of any stripe. You can find people who are religious who fall within this particular definition. You can find people who supposedly are secular, or atheist or agnostic who fall into this also, back and forth, where I look at the position from completely different perspective from both of these ideas. So what I mean by that is, when I look at the Torah and when I look at, how the Torah teaches to approach, like the world in reality, the way I look at it is, a lot of people, within Torah Mosheh look at it, is it provides a foundation for perspectives. The Torah is not here or was not given in order to make it out to be like a book of science, for example. But instead of about perspectives of how to deal with reality as we see it. And then from there, we determine, we basically delve into the scientific aspects of how we deal with reality. And I'll explain what I mean. So when it comes to, the idea of how, one interacts with the world, the natural world, there's one idea that's called Mada'e Elohut, which basically deals with, if you will, the knowledge of how reality exists based upon the source of creation and how the source of creation, set up reality. And that's something as human beings we're always, researching, experimenting on, because again, there are certain areas where, based on the technology of any generation, we're able to master what we're able to master for that generation. And there are some things that we haven't yet been able to, fully explore just because of the limitations of the reality we live in. There's also a concept of ha'ameth. Ha'ameth basically means, the truth, something that is a firm, solid, proof of something to be real or reality. And in some cases, there are situations where just because someone believes that they know what the truth is, they may not know, regardless of where they fall. And it could be certain situations where a person doesn't have the ability or the tools to find what the truth is for that generation or at all. And then there's an idea of Matan Torah Bisinai, meaning that the claim of the Jewish people is different than when you have most religions that, for example, base themselves upon an idea that maybe one person had about what they believe, a deity to be, or what they believe the universe, how it came about. What the Jewish people's claim is that the creator of all things, at Mount Sinai gave the Torah. And from that particular moment, that's when, as a national, level, because it was a national revelation and not just the revelation of one person or two people or whatever, that essentially from there we can move backwards in understanding, okay, well, if the creator of all things provided this scenario, then we can determine how, other things relate to us in terms of reality. But, there are some situations where we have to be knowledgeable about how reality works and test things. So then if we look at like what exactly, the conditions of what, the things I mentioned earlier, for example, the first one being Mada'e Alohut, one of the ways that this is defined is Torah science is the concerted human effort to understand the source of creation, the history of the natural world, and how the natural world works with transmitted information from ancient times to the modern time. Observable physical evidence is the basis of that understanding. It is done through observation of natural phenomena and or through experimentation that tries to simulate natural processes under, controlled conditions. And one of the reasons that, for this definition of how, the Torah relates to science and this definition that, I'm putting in the English language, for example, in translation, is that when you look at the term in Hebrew, often the word that is translated as God into English, as I've mentioned in other videos, is either the words Elohim, El, or Loa. And these are derived from a three root that means Ayin, which is Ayin, Yad, Yud, Lamed, or Ayin, Waw, Lamed. And they basically denote something that has power or strength. So essentially, the words Elohim and El and Eloah don't mean deity, for example. They just mean something that has power or strength. And the claim that we have is that the source of power or strength, the thing that created all things in the universe and created all powers in the universe, is the one that gave the Torah at Mount Sinai. And that nothing created this ultimate, if you will, power or strength or, this reality. And that we can use the term Elohim, El, or Eloah just simply trying to denote something that has power or strength because the words also have the connotation of meaning something that is like a judge, something that has, like a kingship, if you will. So when we deal with the other concept of ha'ameth, something that's considered to be a reality of, that's, one way of translating it in English is truth, but it goes a little bit deeper than that. One of the things we can look at is truth as well as when it comes to facts and all the relatable aspects of facts. So we can look at a couple of different sources. If we look at, I really meant for something to come first, this one here, starting on the left side, Amunuth Haddaoth, which is a book written by Rabbi Saadia Gaon, who lived between 892 to 942 CE. In his book, and this is just the part I've translated for it, he mentions his introduction, and he says something to the idea that it's and da'ath, which sometimes is translated as knowledge or first-hand knowledge, has two sides, truth and falsehood. The knowledge of truth, emeth, is known as a matter that is a form, is from the many is many, the few is few, black is black, white is white. Available is established, and is available is established, and lacking is lacking. So it's like saying, okay, and the reason why I sometimes use words this way, like double words, is because I'm trying to translate a word in Hebrew that has, a couple of different ways you can translate it into English. And he continues this as falsehood. Sheker is known as a matter that is from the many or few, and the few are many. Black is white, white is black, available established is lacking, and lacking is available established. And what he's basically saying is that when we deal with like what is like da'ath, something that is knowledge, the two sides of it deals with, like truth or falsehood. That when you're dealing with emeth, something that's true, it basically is going to return to itself because it's empirical. Meaning that if there's many of something, all the time when you return to it is going to be many. And if there's a few, it's going to be few. Black is always going to return to be black. White is going to return to be white. And something that's established is always going to be established, and something that's lacking is always going to be lacking. And that's how we determine truth because of the fact that it returns back to itself, no matter how many times we experiment with it. So it's no different than like when I was in university, getting my engineering degree. We had, for example, labs that we would have to, like, let's say, chemistry lab or physics lab, and there was an experiment that should result, give us certain results. But if every time we do, we get different results, we have to try to figure out why. Maybe there's like, something that's contaminating the space, to where we're not getting the results we have because of a contamination to the experiment. Maybe there's something we didn't do right in terms of the process. But if every time we do an experiment, it keeps coming back to itself, that's something that we can establish as ameth. But if something, every time we do it, it gives a different result, that's sheker, something that's like a falsehood. So this is the way that Rav Saad Dagon in his introduction, living in the time he lived in, dealt with the idea of how do we determine, facts. Now, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, who lived from 1135 to 1204 CE, he wrote in his book Moreh Nevuchim, Book 1, Chapter 2, through the intellect, man distinguishes between the true and the false, the right and the wrong, are terms employed in the science of apparent truths, not in that of necessary truths. Similarly, our language expresses the idea of true and false by the terms ameth and sheker, of the apparent truths of right and wrong by tov and ra. Thus, it is the function of the intellect to discriminate between the true and the false, a distinction which is applicable to all objects of intellectual perception. And this is one of the bases that, those of us who hold by Torath Mosheh use to determine, not just facts in terms of, the Torah itself and the history of the Jewish people, but also in terms of just like reality itself and what you could say is the science of reality, as I call it. Now, also we have from a book named the Kuzari in the first book, essentially a section, and I've shown this in other videos, that says the following: "Chalila la'ela shetovot haTorah b'ma sheyidaha u'ra'oyo o mofet, ach tovo b'niflaot v'shanot u'min hagim livriath דבורים, או להפוך דבר אלא דבר אחר, להורות על חוכמת בורא העולם ויכולתו, לעשות מה שחופץ בעץ ויחפוץ. בעץ ויחפוץ. יחפוץ. So essentially what this translates into is that the Torah cannot contradict what is seen and proven to be true. It's not a situation where the creator of all things has given the Torah to contradict everything that we see and prove to be true. Now, this is a bit different than the concept of something that we believe to be true because of, the current circumstance. Meaning that if, let's say a good example, quick example, evolution. There's nothing in the Torah that says there's no such thing as evolution. But the question becomes, what do we mean by the word evolution in the English language? So for example, if someone were to say that, human beings came from chimpanzees, obviously that's not true. I mean, that's obviously not true for a lot of different reasons. And even scientifically, the current science says that that's not true. So the issue is that sometimes people who, let's say, want to represent a scientific mind will mistakenly think that when a scientist says that, let's say chimpanzees and like, let's say gorillas and certain types of primates have a common ancestor, that they're saying it was a monkey. When in reality, it's like, obviously it wasn't something we've ever seen before. So if the science proves or if reality shows us that that's the case, the Torah is not there to try to contradict it. It's just a matter of we have to understand what the Torah is saying, what Hashem is saying. And there are some situations we may say where our understanding of the Torah is not adequate. But now that we have the science to back things up, we have a better understanding of what the Torah is saying. Because it's not impossible, but even based on the Torah, that humanity, has a common ancestors with things that we could currently consider to be chimpanzees. Especially there's even a midrash that actually talks about this, where it suggests at some point that there was a common ancestor somewhere between humans and what we would modernly call, apes and things like that. It deals with this specifically, dealing with a particular parasha with what's called Migdal Bavel. So there are midrashim that talk about that. And again, how you take a midrash depends upon a lot of different factors. So let's get a little bit more further into something that Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, the Rambam, mentions in his text called the Shmoneh Parakim. So he says the following: "ודע כי הדברים שאומר בפרקים האלו ובמה שיבוא מן הפירוש אינם עניינים שהידשתים אני מבלי, ולא פירושים שאני המציאם, אלא הם עניינים אלוקתיים מדברי החכמים, מדרשות ובתלמוד, וזולתו וחיבוריהם, והם מדברי הפילוסופים הראשונים, ומחברי הרבה מבני אדם, וקבל האמת ממי שאמרו." So essentially what the Rambam mentions is that, for someone not to think that he's like just making things up, but that he essentially, kind of gone over the different information that can be found in various midrashim and the Talmud, in different writings that exist, and also the philosophers of, what he would call the first philosophers. And basically what he essentially says at the end is that, we receive the truth from wherever it comes. Again, the truth, something that is established that, returns back to itself. So again, there's nothing wrong with saying that there are theories that exist about a certain idea. There's nothing wrong with saying that the current scientific judgment is that potentially this is how the reality works, or this is how something happened in the past. But that could always be overturned, especially when new facts come out. And we, go by whatever's available at that time. So I don't have to go back and say, okay, well, just because a scientist says this, and I hope the Torah, I have to ignore everything that exists. Depends what exactly is science and where exactly does information come from, and is it something that will always return back to itself and can never be overturned by a future generation that says we have more facts. A good example of this is that when we look at things, again, we talk about evolution and how the world, operates. One of the things that we lack in the current age is that, let's say I find a group of bones that appear to me to be human, based on our current definition of what a human even is. That doesn't mean that anybody standing today descends from whoever or whatever those bones were. So for example, there's a set of bones called, I think, Lucy, they call it, that was found somewhere around Ethiopia. There's no evidence that that actual, whatever it was, gave birth to anything that still exists right now. So what it could be is that if you do a DNA test, you may find some similarity in the genetics between a modern day human and that whatever that set of bones was. But that doesn't mean we come from whatever that set of bones was. It just simply means that there may have been a common ancestry somehow. And that leaves questions more than anything else, but there's nothing wrong with having theories about it. So going to, still staying with Rabbi Moshe by Maimon and going to the Moreh Nevuchim and Chelak Bet, which is like the second book, which is in section Het, which is 8. He says, וידוע לך שהם הכרעו כדעת חכמי אומות העולם, על פני דעתם בעניינים האסטרונומיים האלה, כפי שאמרו בבירור, וניסחו חכמי אומות העולם. וזה נכון. כי מי שדן בעניינים הענייניים עושה זאת רק לפי מה שהעיון הביא עליו, ולכן מאמינים במה שהוכחו לו התאמתו. So essentially translating what he's saying is that when it comes to facts, when we're dealing with something that's facts, it's not a problem to say that there are situations where the nations, when it comes to how like the sciences work, the mathematics works, physics works, things like that the nations may have understanding that we as Jews don't have. And there's nothing wrong with saying that. And it's right to say that if someone can prove something from the the reality as we see it is true, we can accept that as being true. But, one of the things that's mentioned later is when it comes to the Torah is our expertise. But when it comes to just like natural sciences and things like that, we can go by what the nations say, and we based upon what he says here in the red, if we're going to believe something, we believe it based upon whatever proofs are available to prove out what the truth is. And that's the thing that, if something proves something when I'm 10 years old, but then when I'm 30, there's something that overturns that, thing that I thought was proven true. There's nothing wrong with going, and saying, okay, well, this is the current proof. That's what I hold by, unless something else comes and contradicts it. And this concept, also can be found in one of the midrashim called Echa Rabbah, which is like the I think like the Ecclesiastes, what do you call it, midrash. So where it basically says, and I'll just go to the part where it mentions the queens, Im yomar lecha adam yesh chokmah bagoyim toamin hadahu. So it's like saying, if someone were to tell you that there's wisdom in the non-Jewish nation, believe him. And he quotes like Ovadia, "V'ha'avaratai hachomim me'odom u'thuvono mehar esov." So essentially, if the nations like have evidence of something that is proven to be true, we can accept that. And it says, "Yesh Torah b'joyim al ta'amin." So what he's saying is, but if someone tells you, okay, well, the Torah is accurately understood, outside of the people of Israel, that we don't believe, because again, that's our expertise. So it'd be like someone trying to tell me who, like, let's say, doesn't know Hebrew, doesn't know Aramaic, what the Torah is saying, in like, let's say, the book of Yeshayahu. There's no way possible because of the fact that as Jews, we have the tradition of, how the Hebrew language works, and we know exactly what the text says, and we have the most ancient texts of these matters. So we accept the truth from wherever it comes, and it can come from a non-Jewish source, but when it comes to the Torah, that's the expertise of the Jewish people, and that's where we stay within those confines. So then dealing with, okay, well, even from the Torah perspective, what are the disciplines, of science that, that exist all around the world? And these are, different ideas, within the Western world of what is available as science. And again, if something's proven to be true in like high energy physics, I don't have to go against it just because it may, be an idea that doesn't come from the Jewish people. The Torah is not there to try to explain all these things. The Torah gives a basis for me to learn and understand how to found, if you will, establish myself in learning these things. So there's nothing wrong with learning biology. When I was in university, I had to learn biology. It was a requirement of, learning engineering. It was, just one of the requirements. When you say, okay, genetics, hereditary, evolution, biology, there's nothing wrong with that. But we have to also look and say, what are the sources for this and what exactly is proven and what is like currently theoretical and how did they determine the proofs? And that's where we would look at that. So there's certain things in what's considered to be the theory of, certain theories about evolution that I could say, okay, I challenge that not because of the fact that I don't believe something can evolve, but the issue is that am I really saying what someone considered evolution, or am I just simply saying natural selection, which makes more sense in a sense, meaning that, natural selection would be like an idea of, let's say, a group of birds or stranded on an island. And the only way to survive on that island for as a bird is a bird with a short, like a long beak in order to reach down and get certain animals. Well, that means that all the short, beak ones are probably going to die out more than likely. And that anything born with a short beak is simply going to die out before a certain time. Now, from a certain perspective, if I show up on the island and I have no idea about any of these it matters, if you will, and I look and I only see long beak birds, but then I see bones that at one point there were shorter beak birds, my perspective could be, incorrect or correctly, idea that there's something biologically happening that's almost like mystical or magical to where something is changing completely into something different that can't possibly have happened, in a certain way. Where instead it's just like, okay, well, that's just natural selection. The birds with the longer beaks survive simply because they have the beaks that fit, to be able to get the kind of food they needed. And, it could be vice versa. So the basic issue is that We have to understand what we're even looking at, and that's where it requires to have a certain perspective. So sometimes people I've found when this argument comes up, there are people who talk about science as if it's like some physical thing rather than just a concept of how humans try to understand the world. And that's the way I look at it. I mean, when someone says science, I'm looking at it as like, well, science doesn't know this, science doesn't know that. Well, science isn't like a physical thing. Science is just, a word used to describe information of current human knowledge about certain elements of how reality works. And that's what it is. When I was in engineering school, I had to do math. I mean, there's nothing in there that disproves anything in the Torah. Even, when you look at all of these, there's nothing here that disproves elements of the Torah. So I mean, again, the idea is that the Torah is not here to explain all of this stuff. It's a part of being human that we're supposed to investigate everything that we have termed to be these things. So there are a number of books, and I've only listed a few here that are, Torath Mosheh books that basically deal with the science of the day, if so to speak. So the Rambam, we saw the time that he lived versus the time of Rav Saadia Gaon. Now, the idea that some people have is that, okay, well, Rav Saadia Gaon understood modern science. Well, of course not. He didn't live during the modern time. He lived like about 1,000 years ago. But during his time, he understood the scientific method. And I actually, in one of his commentary, on the book of Mishle, the book of Proverbs. In his introduction, he actually describes exactly the scientific, principles that are used today of how to investigate, matters and how things work in reality. In fact, I'll provide a link at the bottom, and if you go to the link, you'll be able to see like a group of writings I did on a forum where I discuss some of these issues as well as other issues of science. Rabbi Zamir Cohen is a rabbi that lives currently, and he has a number of books that deal with like the connection between Torah and science and how there's no contradiction between the two. And with anything that you read, of course, you have to kind of take it and say, okay, let me investigate it. I don't have to hold by to be all of it to be true just because rabbi writes it. Because like the Rambam mentions, someone could be right about something they're writing and something could be wrong even if it's not written, and something and vice versa. But there's a number of rabbis, and also like Jewish scholars who hold by Torah who have been involved in science. And again, it's not some thing that's outside of the custom. We don't have to prove that science is wrong or scientists are wrong in order to say the Torah is correct. No, science is just a matter of how we investigate the world around us, and we have the ability to come to different conclusions about certain things based upon whatever proofs are available. And this is something that is ancient within the Torah-based Jewish community, because I've come across people who make it seem as if like there's no way possible rabbis living 1,000 years ago, even 2,000 years ago, had a scientific method. Where if you look at the thing I'll post in the description of this video, there are different cultures around the world in ancient times who had their own scientific method. But again, what's the difference between then and now? Well, obviously, let's say 3,000 years ago, a scientist wouldn't have had, the ability to, to use a modern day microscope, or a telescope. That wasn't available to them. But they were making, whatever, theoretical predictions they could make and investigating the world based on what was available. And there's nothing wrong with that. The current science that we have today, in 1,000 years, we could look and say, well, hey, these guys are superstitious. Can you believe they believed in this kind of thing? Or you can believe they did this? That doesn't make any sense because, again, in 1,000 years, hopefully, the technology will be better than it is now. The understanding of the environment around us will be better. And just a good example, a quick example before I end, right now, we don't currently have any human being that's been to Mars as far as we know. So imagine how different, things will be when someone's able to actually go there, take the actual like dirt that's there or whatever's there and investigate it physically rather than having robots do it. Imagine what the scientific understanding was before they were able to send a probe to Mars. There was actually, I think, in the 1960s, a particular, I think it was, I can't remember if it was the head of NASA or something, but there was a person who was involved in NASA, if I remember correctly, who was a scientist who believed that there was already life on Mars. And he had all these exotic ideas of what life on Mars would look like. And obviously, the first probe gets there, and there's nothing like what he was thinking was there. There's nothing wrong with the speculation. I mean, again, it's speculation. And this is something that the Torath Moshe concept does not go against or deny. So this is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever. Thank you for listening and bye.